Claire Goldsmith is an advisor and consultant in education strategy and innovation for schools, nonprofits, and tech companies. A former teacher, she has worked in online learning for over a decade, running admissions and external relations at Stanford Online High School, and then serving as executive director of the Malone Schools Online Network, where she strategically expanded the independent school online learning consortium and led professional development for teachers nationwide. She is the board chair of the Enrollment Management Association and serves as a trustee and advisor at several renowned independent schools. Her writing has appeared in Chalkbeat and the Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much, Claire, for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
So, the first thing I want to ask you about is something that has been on the mind of, I think, most parents that went through COVID and distance learning. So, COVID opened the floodgates for technology use with distance learning at home. iPad sales, for example, grew 31% in 2020. So, how do you think COVID lockdowns affected kids' relationship with technology?
So, I've been called an online learning optimist, given my decade of experience in the space before the pandemic even started. And yet, while I'm an enthusiast for online learning, I want to be clear that in many ways, the pandemic was actually a pretty terrible moment educationally for the country's and the world's children, with all these documented learning gaps, both academically and social emotionally, that we're still dealing with today. So I will get to your question, but I think that context is important. We saw that technology in the pandemic could actually be the answer to much of what we wanted it to do. School, work, and play. I marveled at the fact that my then 3 year old could suddenly do dance class over Zoom with her teachers and her classmates, or that I could have really meaningful conversations with middle school classmates of mine that I wouldn't be engaging with in that way if it weren't for the pandemic as a forcing mechanism and the technology that enabled that. So, therefore, while the narrative has surely turned to cast a very negative light on what we all went through, especially in learning, and for good reason, it's notable that a quarter of US school districts are actually operating online schools now. And in urban districts, that's even higher. I think it's like a ninefold increase since before the pandemic. And every day, you and I, I'm sure, both speak to people who now work from home who didn't
Mhm.
before. So we take for granted the fact that now we can do these kinds of things in Zoom, and that's been a pretty fundamental shift. So I think what this shift has let us see is that there's actually nuance in the screen time conversation. My then 3 year old who was inventing stories for her preschool classmates on Zoom had almost no screen time exposure really up until that point. But we drew a major distinction between her sort of mindlessly watching something that wasn't age appropriate and interacting with teachers and classmates. So it has become not as much about screen time versus not, but what kind of screen time.
Yeah.
There's a recent book out, a great scholar named Katie Davis, who lays this out in her book called Technology's Child. And she and so many others in the space are now really able to get into what makes sort of better screen time than other screen time. We've known for a while that interactive screen time, like Zoom, is healthier than that passive viewing. Even the American Academy of Pediatrics has come out and said that. And now we know that there are all these other elements that help us sort through what's healthy and what's not. And you're really an expert in this. But it's things like screen time that's more self-directed for children than passive, meaning the child controls the pacing and makes choices. Screen time is better when it's more community supported, right? So it's set up to be experienced with a parent or with a caregiver. It should not be distracting. It should be easy to navigate. And the scholarship is really recommending now in this more nuanced space that it depends on the child, the specific child. It depends on the context. That parents should pay attention, and caregivers, to content, the quality of what kids are engaging with. And also the notion of opportunity cost, which is like, well, what would the child be doing if they weren't on a screen at that time? So to get to your question, there is certainly a pretty dark story to tell about the pandemic and tech. School didn't work for a lot of kids, isolation, loneliness, and all of that. But it has also made us understand how to navigate screen time, and use it better as consumers, as parents, as educators, and also, frankly, for those of us that are in the space of designing screen time for kids, like how we can do that better.
Yeah. As you were talking about the idea of not being mindless, right? And one of the things we always advocate for is modeling technology as a tool, right? So you mentioned Zoom and all these other tools, right, that are considered better screen time, healthier screen time. So that was a big thing that came to mind where I think we align a lot. And also, you're absolutely right. I almost don't like the word screen time because not all screen time is created equal. It's really about what are you doing on there? What is it, collective or is it individual? Is it mindful or mindless? So I think you touched on all of those points, obviously from an education point of view, but also from a personal point of view. And I think we are, like you said, as parents, more mindful, hopefully, than before about what our kids are doing because we saw it. We were there every day with our kids.
So even those of us that are in this space made a lot of mistakes and are still making mistakes. It's an
Of
evolving.
course. Yeah. Nobody is perfect. This is hard for all of us to navigate, even if you know what you're doing, right? So, absolutely. I think we just need to be just empathetic to each other as parents and to ourselves, right? We're all doing our best. This is a brand new issue and something we're all figuring out how to navigate. Okay, so my next question at Dopamine, we use the term digital privilege, and we use it to describe how either socioeconomic status, work volume, so how much somebody works, and access to family support can almost create like a privilege to unplug or limit tech. It is a privilege to be able to do this, right? So that could be on an individual basis, on a family basis. So how do you see our differences in these areas defining our relationship to technology?
So this is a huge issue, and one that we've talked about for a really long time in the digital education space and just in education broadly. It really came to the forefront in the pandemic. I remember once I was actually on TV talking about how to set your home up for online learning. And the next segment was actually about children here in Los Angeles trying to do online learning from their cars because they had nowhere else to go, right? There were
Yeah.
just these incredibly stark differences in the experience people had based on their resources available. Another good example is in the online learning space, we've always discussed the fact that it's so great to sort of get to know a student when they're in their home. Like you can see into their home in class and their learning situation, and you can do projects that bring the home environment into class. Well, that's great. But we really saw in the pandemic the flip side, which is that some students didn't want their teachers and classmates seeing where they lived and drawing conclusions or comparisons. And so that's how you get into these interesting debates about like, should cameras be on or should cameras be off in online classes? That's a real conversation. So, as far as digital privilege relating to limiting tech, I think you're right that, it's not just about privilege in tech in that, do you have the latest iPad or not? Or do you have enough devices for all of your children? It's, do you have also the resources to limit tech if that's what you want to be doing as a parent? Um, I think this is why some of the narrative of entirely banning device use for kids or banning screen time can be really unfair or can feel judgmental, because it just doesn't take into account those family factors that you talked about so well. And it's not just about childcare and workload; it's also peer pressure. What are kids also seeing their friends do, and that's coming into your home, and that's hard to contend with too. Um, I've certainly found myself torn on this one. I know very well the research that shows you should be co-viewing
Yeah.
digital media with your kids, but I can't always do that. Sometimes the iPad comes out in my house precisely because I can't be present for my child in that moment. I don't think we should be making parents feel guilty for that. I think this is an important conversation, and there's even some really great new research coming out around digital privilege, and it's certainly a topic to watch.
Yeah, so it's just such an interesting conundrum. Everything you talked about earlier, so true, right? That there can be better screen time with community screen time, the quality of screen time, all that. But at the same time, that involves parents having to be present with our kids. And let's be honest, we all use it as a babysitter. So this makes it just really, really challenging on a family level for sure. Okay, so my next question. According to a 2022 Pew poll, US adults over 30 are now almost as likely to trust information on social media as information from national news outlets. So, how can parents teach their kids to question sources if they allow their kids to go online independently?
So, Annika, I think this is just the key question. It's an enormous challenge, and thankfully, a lot of smart people are working on it. But yeah, I mean, we're seeing this right now with rampant misinformation, disinformation, the complete blurring of fact and opinion. And it's now multiplied exponentially, as you know very well, based on social media algorithms. So, media literacy can start much earlier than many of us think. It can start when you're reading a very young child a book. And when we read to kids, we ask them questions like, oh, how do you think the character feels right now? Or why is the little teddy bear sad? Or what do you think is going to happen next? And that can actually be media literacy if you pause and you ask children to tell you why they answered a certain way. Oh,
Yeah.
why do you think that character is sad? How do you know? Huh, maybe your sister has a different opinion on that. So you're starting early with the idea that people can have different views, that
Yeah.
your takeaways should be informed by some kind of evidence. I think with slightly older kids, this method can extend to something even like the cereal box. So when I was a debate coach, we used to take advertisements from magazines and hand them out to my students in the class. And I would have them look at ads and try to tell me what the argument was that was being made in an ad. And was there any reasoning? And by the way, is there any evidence for the claim that this ad is making? So back to the cereal box, that's looking at the thing sitting on your kitchen table and it says, oh, it says high protein. Well, what does that mean? How do we know whether that's true? What does that imply about protein? How does the rest of the packaging on the cereal box, conflict with or support this argument about protein? So that's little kids just making the point that we question, we unpack. With my kids, what I try to do is really scrutinize sources and also triangulate among many sources. So when my kids ask me questions, and my son loves, science facts, so he's asking about the atmosphere on Mars, and I don't know, I'm not an expert in that by far, so I've got to look that up. So I might start by pulling up, looking on YouTube and pulling something up, but then saying, is this a good quality video that's going to give us the answer we're looking for? I'm actually not sure it is. And then we maybe refine the search together. And then we go to one of his science books. And then maybe we take a trip to the library. So I'm constantly modeling that you never take one source at face value and that some sources are just not as good as others. So those are just some examples of how you can start early.
Those are great. The one thing that came to mind as kids get older, I'm just going to throw in a quick follow up. What do you think about political slants, right? There could be news from a reputable news source that sounds very different depending on that source. What do you think about that for older kids, let's say teens?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think this needs to be explicitly taught starting at
Yeah.
least in middle school, whether
Yeah.
it's interwoven into the curriculum or whether it's its own class on media literacy.
Right.
I saw an amazing example of this recently in the high school context where a video about the history of Israel was had been sort of circulated in a curricular context, and I watched the video and I realized it had some bias and it had some missing information. Turned out that the video was actually being used to prove that point in an educational context, that it was actually there for students to unpack and talk about different narratives on the same history and how they can be expressed through media in the images that are used, in music that's used, in words that are used. So it was actually a pretty brilliant exercise. But if I had just seen the video stand alone, I would have thought, oh my goodness, this is this is so biased. How is this being used in school? But it was being used to prove that point. So yes, we always, at home and in school should be teaching like that, making that point about the news constantly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just comes back to what you were saying earlier. It's just like we need to be teaching critical thinking, whether that's at home or whether that's at school. I think it just comes down to that. Same thing for media literacy. These are critical thinking skills, right? Questioning sources, questioning information. Okay, so speaking of the classroom, this is a kind of a hot button topic right now, should parents have a choice about how much technology and what type of technology their children are exposed to in the classroom?
So parents should always have some degree of input as regards what happens in schools and with their kids. And I think we have avenues for that, whether in the public school or the private school context. And parents should exercise their voices and their choices. As an educator, I will say that I believe parents should trust the institutions to which they send their children, and assume the best, assume that technology integration is thoughtful and educationally coherent. And I would say it's always better to ask questions as a parent than start with judgments. On the educator side, there are, of course, a tremendous number of best practices and principles that I think we need to be following. One is that we should not use technology for technology's sake. Like that's the tail wagging the dog. And every use of technology should have an educational value. And you need to have an argument for why you've brought technology into the classroom context in a given moment. Another sort of key principle is that we as educators shouldn't be requiring the use of technology that's clearly categorized as dangerous or in any sense of the term, or a product that whose terms of use state that they're not meant for children of a certain age. So I do think there are some really important guardrails there where technology in schools, we can't be doing things that are dangerous or that are not for kids.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really simple way of looking at it. I think where it's come up, just in my travels speaking to so many parents, it's a little bit more specifically kids that might have a neurodivergent, diagnosis of some kind, right? ADHD, kids that have, for example, that have, maybe sensitive that are reward seeking, right? Kids like that are having trouble focusing, right? When technology is put in front of them.
I'm sure is a category of accommodation that does or will include sort of tech issues like that. I think, it's always about a dialogue with the school, about the individual child. And, really great educators are able to differentiate.
One size really doesn't fit all, right? So I think that translates into the classroom too, which might make it challenging for educators. But to your point, I agree. I think a good educator can sort of, navigate that as just like they would navigate anything else, right? Any other tool in the classroom.
Exactly. And I think that, you know, technology also has the ability to help really personalize. So actually
Yeah.
for students that are neurodivergent or have different needs, technology can also be a solution. It just totally depends. And so that's where the kind of personalization comes in, the ability of great educators to differentiate, to understand where children are coming from and meet their needs.
Yeah. Okay, so last question is about AI, which you have written about. It is a huge buzzword right now in our current time, right? So, how can we embrace generative AI, which is really what we're talking about right now, use by kids in the classroom or at home?
Yeah. So, it's a great question. I sometimes get asked, does AI just mean the end of education or like the end of school? Like, why even go to school anymore? And the answer is no, it is not the end of education in school. And I fundamentally believe in the promise of AI to actually deepen education. So I should say I'm not minimizing the incredibly disruptive nature of tools like ChatGPT. AI absolutely presents really serious ethical and privacy concerns. It can include bias, disinformation, and it's going to change the way we work and live. So, not minimizing that at all. But used the right way, I think there's just much more good than harm. We, and I say this because there's a history to this stuff, which is, we in education sort of freaked out when the radio came on the scene, in fact, and television. And, I remember when Wikipedia was available, and all of a sudden we were like, what are our students going to do? How are they going to write a good research paper anymore? It's all out there on Wikipedia. Um, or language translators, or the calculator. I mean, it turns out we still do math even with the calculator. Education has always adapted to new technology really well and found a positive use for it. And part of why I believe that's the case with AI specifically is that, yes, AI can spit out the right answer pretty easily. It can even write like fairly competent, research papers and essays. But good education was never about just spitting out the right answer. As a friend of mine, an educator, told me recently, if the process of learning is artificial, then artificial intelligence is really well suited for it. If school is created to sort of be artificial, AI can be the solution. But we actually want to go deeper and we want to be emphasizing critical thinking. And I'll get into how we do that in a second. I also think that AI can herald in a new age of creativity. And for this, I go back to the metaphor of the camera. Like when the camera was invented, it's not as though we just stopped doing all visual art. And in fact, we developed a new medium, which was called photography. And then we created film from that. And so there's this idea that, there's a world of sort of art and creativity that AI will bring in that we just don't know yet. So getting more specific, like how is this going to happen? I think what we're going to start seeing is much more of what we call the flipped classroom, which is the idea that many of the things that in our education we did as homework will now be done in school. And many of the things that we experienced in the classroom will be done at home. Because a teacher can easily record a lecture explaining something for kids to watch at home, and they can even rewatch it and stop if they don't understand something. And then when they're in the classroom, the amazing teacher is there to help them work through the material, to answer their questions, to facilitate group work and debate and discussion, which are actually the most human elements of learning. And so getting to a place where these slightly more rote pieces of the education matrix can be done using technology, can be done at home. And what we're bringing into the classroom is like connection and going deeper with material. So I think we're going to see a lot of that. I think we're going to see a lot of focus on the process and not just the results. So like, I don't know if in school your math teacher ever said to you, show your work, right?
Mhm.
So the idea of showing your work, I think, is becoming more and more important because anyone can just, could cheat in theory using AI. So teachers are going to want to know, well, how did you get to that thesis statement? Or you've just written this paper with an argument in it. Now, could you please give me the counter argument? Or how did you analyze the evidence? Like these are going to be conversations in class. They're going to be assignments that are all about unpacking that process. Um, and I think third, we've got to start focusing more on excellence and not just competence. right? So AI can write like a competent paper, but it
Yeah.
can't necessarily write an excellent paper. And so I think this is going to raise the bar on learning and actually push kids to have more original thinking and more creativity in their work. So all in all, it's this is going to change a lot. I think it's going to raise the bar. It's going to allow us to go further faster in learning. Um, and we do need to be aware of some of the roadblocks or pitfalls. No one ever got stronger by watching someone else exercise, right? And we don't want to be letting AI do the work for us, because then we're skipping all of the actual thinking that goes into learning and a lot of the feeling that goes into learning. We can't lose that. So it's about redoing assignments, thinking differently. And I think that's going to actually push us to get to a new paradigm of learning that could be even more exciting.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think what you're saying just keeps resonating with me with this technology as the tool idea, right? Like, same thing with AI. And then the critical thinking keeps coming up again, right? I mean, as it is now, and I don't know if this will change anytime soon, but generative AI does have what are called hallucinations, which is basically AI being so sure that it is right, where it is very wrong, right? So, like you said, whether it's in the classroom or at home, kind of critically going through what AI spits out and then cross-checking it, I think is a great exercise, right? So there's so many things that, to your point, can actually help make kids smarter in that way, in that process that you were talking about. So I'm optimistic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that, that also opens up another opportunity with kids, which is explaining about hallucinations and how that happens and all of that, but also making the point that these are tools created by humans, just like
Yeah.
them. And it's an empowerment argument. It's like, you can actually work to build something like this to make this better so it doesn't do that hallucination thing. You could use this to cure diseases or whatever problem you see in the world. And I think that's what we've got to lean into with young people. Their own amazing ability to harness this technology. And that's, by the way, also why school still matters. You've got to know how to use this. You've got to have the skills. You've got to have the ethics. You got to have the teamwork, the leadership to be able to live in a world with all of this technology.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time and all your insights. And I love, everything you've added on the education side and kind of connecting the dots for parents. So I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much. And thanks for all the great work you're doing.
Thank you.